What's up, guys? So we have a very interesting opportunity today. It is not every day that we have almost every Diablo variant here at Curated, and I thought what a cool time to sort of give you guys an up-close look of every sort of model, variation, change in the Diablo life cycle. Diablo was produced essentially 1990 to 2001, and I am sitting with the early two-wheel drive coupes. These cars are super crude, they're super raw. Now, I will tell you that I'm not incredibly in love with these cars, but there's a cult following for these cars just because they're so raw, they're so radical. I did a video recently, I don't know if you guys remember, where I drove this and a 6.0 back-to-back to sort of talk about all the differences. Now, the major differences that everyone always talks about is the big dash. These early Diablos had this massive dash affixed to that in the steering column that is not power steering. So these cars are very difficult to drive. The clutch is very, very heavy. Now, I don't know if Hooper knows, but is it a push clutch or a pull clutch on a 91? So it's a pull clutch, which was later modified, and we'll talk about that, I think in mid-1994, 1995, and we'll show you guys that on the SE30. But the interior pretty much stayed the same throughout the Diablo life cycle. The seats, we'll show you a few nuances. And the first early cars actually had gray mirrors. This is one of the earliest cars that I've ever seen. There's a 91 where the mirrors were color-coded to match the rest of the car. But essentially, you'll see these cars had the same wheels, they had the same rear, and this was produced until 1993 and the introduction of the VT. These cars are badass, they're raw, no traction control, no power steering. The AC's okay, but they're very, very fast, and that's because they're lightweight as well. There's not as many computers, there's not all the suspension stuff, the suspension lifter, which we'll show you guys. But yes, the early 1991, essentially 1990 to 1993 Diablo. For the world, production on these early cars is about 870 to 950 cars. If you check the International Lamborghini Registry, where we have all the factory records, I think we've recorded around 900 cars. Back in the showroom, and we're standing with the sort of next evolution of the Diablo and the first special edition models. Now, prior to the SE30, Lamborghini launched the 93 Diablo VT, which was the four-wheel drive car. You'll see some of the features featured on the SE30 that was featured on the VT car. They had a lower dash, and they had then on the front, we don't have one here right now, but they had some extra air intakes. The VT cars in 93 also received basically power steering. The AC was updated, and like I mentioned, the clutch was updated as well. The 94 VT cars also received at that point the suspension dampeners, so sort of electronic suspension. And I'm trying to think a few other details really changed. I think they updated the radio and things like that. But essentially, this is very much a similar car. And really, the VT Coupe was then produced up until 1999, which will show you guys sort of the changes in the VT Coupe. Here is one of my favorites. This is the first purpose-built sort of race car for the street that Lamborghini had built. This is the SE30. Now, going around the SE30, you start to see all the differences. The first difference when you're at the front is you see it's actually a carbon fiber hood. The badge was actually moved to the front bumper, carbon fiber bumper, much lower in the front than a VT. These cars actually scrape in the front. They're as low as an F40, if not lower. And then as you go around an SE30, you see things like the magnesium wheels. You see the racing brakes. You see the full carbon interior. And the SE30 was essentially produced by Lamborghini to celebrate the 30th anniversary of the company. Designed by Pagani, produced by sort of these race-inspired guys that were also working with their Formula One team at the time. So cool little features in the SE30. It actually has a different steering wheel. It has carbon seats, so you can actually see carbon seat buckets, full carbon interior. These cars also had an adjustable sway bar inside. They had traction control. There was an option for a fire extinguisher, and then one of the coolest features is this little window here So no power windows, lightweight, a little bit of access to give you some air, but very cool, all carbon. And then look at the rear. I mean, the hood is all carbon. And then look at this. All of the carbon cladding in the engine bay. And that's really what's so impressive about the SE30. This is not a regular Diablo engine. The European SE30s had a different crankshaft, different cams, different valves, producing a lot more than 500 horsepower, almost 530, 540 horsepower. And then that's one of the reasons, and you look at these iconic wheels, the magnesium wheels and titanium lug nuts here, that's actually the reason in period these used to actually crack because there was so much torque. So Lamborghini had an update for these wheels. It was like almost like a spacer you'd put behind the wheel because these cars were so light and had so much torque. Another cool feature about these cars on the Euro cars, the racing fuel filler, super cool. And then just going around it quickly, this was the first year of this wing. It's the adjustable wing that was later used on the SV, similar on the GT, which we'll talk about. The early cars had a different higher wing that would have only been used on the early Diablos. Albert can fill in a photo of that. And then the biggest change I'd say on the SE30 is the rear bumper. It's a big rear bumper. We'll show you how it sort of molds with the rest of the car. The reverse light and fog light removed here. It's also because it generates a lot of heat here, so sometimes the lights would melt. The grille goes across the back. And then another interesting feature that we'll later see on Diablo Roadsters is these side skirts that sort of are really beautiful, and they go with the lines of the SE30. Just making this car that, so special. There's so many different features on these cars. And essentially, the SE30 was the base for the famous Jota. So the Jota was a kit that was produced by Lamborghini for VIP clients to go racing. I think the first client was a Japanese client. And essentially, the BPR GT series at the time, you had the McLaren F1, the F40, all these cars. So Lamborghini produced an intake system that would go here on the engine, different cams. We've talked about this before, four independent throttle bodies, and the scoops that would feed the air into the engine. So very, very cool. There's about 19 factory cars, Jota cars, that have been documented in the records. We know there's more. Some kits were sold to dealers. Of those 19 to 30 factory Jotas, they were produced on the 150 original SE30 cars were produced. So 150 total. Of that, let's call it 30 were Jotas. So very, very rare, very cool cars. And essentially the SE30, being it was two-wheel drive, was the evolution into the Diablo SV. So we are standing with a pretty early Diablo SV. You can actually tell because it has this 17-inch wheel in the front. The later production Diablo Roadsters and SVs all came with 18-inch wheels, but that is one of the noticeable features of an SV that you could see. If we start, let's start from the front again to the rear. Introduced as a way for Lamborghini to sell more cars. A sport edition SV was, again, two-wheel drive like the SE30. Probably 330 cars were produced for the world between 1996 and 1999. So we'll talk about that evolution as well. These cars had a different front bumper, the same fog lights as a Roadster. It had these scoops with this satin black feature there. The beautiful Root OZ wheels, the OZ racing wheels, which are very cool. SVs had power windows. So unlike the SE30s, they again had the lighter clutch. The early SVs did not come with an airbag, but later production cars all had an airbag, and in the US they actually had dual airbags. This is originally a European car. SVs had the SE30 style interior, Alcantara, raw door panels, so very raw trimmings. They also had a unique shift knob that was only used for the SV. And then European SVs had this race fuel filler is the same, different rockers with no fins, as you guys can see. Very similar scoops to the Jota. Unfortunately, no throttle bodies, independent throttle bodies like the Jota. This really had a standard sort of Diablo engine that was bumped up to about 530 horsepower. Again, rear-wheel drive. This car is missing its wing right now, but it's basically an SE30 wing that was satin black from the factory originally. with satin black features. You've got this grille here. And then this actually uses a unique bumper. This would have been a smaller bumper than the SE30, specific to the SV cars. I'll show you guys later. The Roadster bumper would have been a little bit different. And these are just such cool cars. I think, you know, production was so limited. And again, this is Lamborghini's racing version of their Diablo. So you can't really talk about Diablos without talking about the iconic Diablo Roadster. Originally launched in 1996, all Diablo Roadsters were four-wheel drive. There were a few exceptions. There was one race car and 4 SV Diablo Roadsters, but those are sort of like one-offs. There were four-wheel drives with almost a completely different body. First thing you'll notice is Diablo Roadsters all had a unique front bumper. As we go back through the car, they all had these unique wheels, very much similar to the early Diablo wheel design, just sort of a little more refined. Starting in 1998, these wheels became 18-inch. The early cars actually had the 17-inch wheels, like the SV. You'll see the rockers here are similar to an SE30. So you see Lamborghini probably reused some things and ideas. Diablo Roadster seats are traditionally different. I have seen some variations, but they're a different style than the SV seats. They have more leather in the interior, leather throughout the interior, like a VT coupe, etc. You then obviously have the carbon fiber roof, which goes here, and the different vents compared to a coupe. Now, the Diablo Roadster wing is completely different than all other Diablo production wings. They came in both carbon fiber and painted. The carbon fiber, this is unique for a Millennium Edition or Momo Edition. But then you see the back of this Diablo Roadster, very much like the SE30, a big rear bumper like the SE30. But really, these cars are just so special. I mean, how many V12 manual open roof, supercars have they made in time? Not many. These cars are also very rare. We're talking about 440 or so produced for the world between 96 and 99. We are standing next to a 99, and we'll tell you about all the differences when we move on to the GT. So, 1998. Volkswagen Audi Group purchases Lamborghini, and at that point it's pretty wild to think that Diablo production was so limited. Lamborghini's business plan talked about 180 cars for the world in 1998, which is insane. These cars were not selling well, and today I think, you know, it's wild to see the production numbers. So Volkswagen Audi Group's purchases Lamborghini, and the first thing they do is they relaunch the Diablo in 1999, including a ton of different features. We've got some changes in the mechanicals, but the biggest change is things like the open headlights, as you see on the GT, the different dash, and this was included not just for the GT, but the 99 Roadster, the 99 SV, and the 99 VT Coupe. Now, when you first look, we'll start with the interior of the GT. You see the dash is no longer like a focused position. It's now this beautiful dash that goes across the car. I honestly like both options. I know some guys love the later dash. The later dash does give you a little bit more room in the cockpit, but again, very special car. Now, when we start at the front of the GT, this is where everything changes from all the other cars. You've got a functional front scoop, and different hood. You've got this incredible front bumper in carbon. You've obviously got the lights, and then you have these massive front flares. Now this, the front fenders were later evolved into the Diablo 6.0, which we'll talk about, for a wider front track, which was used for the GT. You see the rockers are completely different with carbon. You have carbon all over the interior and these factory Momo racing seats. The GT came in 2 versions. You could get the race seats or comfort seats as well. Again, GT is power windows, not like the SE30. And then you've got this incredible scoop, and this is functional. This is one of the baddest engines of all time. This is the 6-liter engine, which was later used for the 6.0. We have titanium connecting rods. A lot of badass stuff going on in here. I could talk all day, but we'll try to keep the video short. And then the independent throttle bodies there that are functioning. You can hear them suck. It's very, very cool. And then we've got the carbon wing almost identical to the SE30 and SV, but it's got the rear camera because when that hood is closed, you see nothing behind you. So factory installed rear camera. The tail lights are essentially the first evolution of the 6.0 taillights. The reverse light and fog light were moved to the tail light, so you don't have these on the bumper anymore. This very cool grille, sort of reminiscent of the SVs, and then this unique rear bumper, full carbon rear bumper specific to the GT, and the 2 exhaust coming out from the rear, which we would see on the 6.0. Essentially, this was almost the end of the Diablo production until the Diablo 6.0. Now, the 6.0, Lamborghini produced 80 for the world of the GT. They then produced another 335 cars before they were finished with all Diablo production in 2001. The 6.0 also included a special edition version. If you guys have seen, there's a famous gold and a famous metallic brown. There's 41 of those cars produced, and then the 6.0 essentially for the rest of the world, I think there was 130 that came to North America, and the 6.0 has got to be the most refined. You've got all the carbon fiber features in the interior. You've got the new seats that were only used on the 6.0. It looks similar to the original Diablo bucket design, but it's actually a 2-piece seat. And then you have sort of the 6.0, they cleaned up everything. They integrated into the, fog light and reverse light integrated into the lights. You've got these beautiful magnesium wheels that look, very sort of Lamborghini DNA. The front is very clean, a unique front bumper on the front, a unique rear hood as well. It looks like the first Diablo 2-wheel drive rear hood, but it's all carbon fiber, polished carbon fiber underneath, and very, very cool. Essentially, the end of the Diablo line, and really, really a special car. Unfortunately, we don't have one here today. Without getting into too many variations, we could talk about the Monterey Edition, we could talk about the Momo Edition, we could talk about the Millennium Edition, which were all actually made for the North American market through the distributor. I wanted to give you guys sort of a overall and brief synopsis of Diablo production. It's one of my favorite cars ever made, and I know we get questions all the time about these cars. I promise you we'll have a ton more content coming, but wanted to give you the synopsis from 1990 to 2001. Thank you guys again. Don't forget to like, don't forget to subscribe, and stay tuned.